Madam President.
The senior senator from Illinois.
Madam President, as chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the filling of judicial vacancies has been the focal point of my political attention now for 4 years. There are roughly 800 to 900 federal judges at the district court level, the lower court level, and the circuit court level, and then of course 9 on the Supreme Court. Filling those vacancies is part of our responsibility. People decide to retire, they pass away for various reasons, they leave the bench, and we need to make sure the courts still have people to do their professional job. I listened carefully to my colleague from Kentucky explain his concerns about the filling of 4 circuit court vacancies and the possibility, and I don't know for any certainty, but the possibility that 2 of those 4 judges have decided not to retire, but to stay on the bench. And he raises a question about whether that's fair. Well, I'd like to call the Senate's attention to the fact that there was a moment in time when we were shocked to learn that Supreme Court Justice Anton Scalia had died while on a hunting trip. I believe it was in the month of January or February. Don't have any notes on it here, but I think it was January or February of that year. And it was the last year that President Obama's presidency, the second term. And so the President Obama said he was going to set out to fill the vacancy created by the death of Anton Scalia. And he was proposing his nominee, Merrick Garland, the judge then at the time, who's now our Attorney General. And the decision was made almost instantly by the senator from Kentucky, the same senator who just talked about delaying and filling vacancies. The decision was made by him not to fill the Supreme Court vacancy. This was in February of the last year of Obama's presidency, and in fact, it wasn't filled until the new president, and in this case Donald Trump, came in his first term. Senator McConnell instructed his Republican senators not to meet with Merrick Garland, President Obama's nominee, to wait almost an entire calendar year to fill that vacancy. And he succeeded in that effort so that Donald Trump was able to fill that vacancy and not the situation where the President Obama would have that option. So when I hear the senator come to the floor from Kentucky and talk about whether there's any gamesmanship going on, I don't know. But I will tell you that we saw it at the highest possible level in filling the vacancy on the Supreme Court when Anton Scalia passed away. I think what the American people are looking for is fair play. That's not unreasonable. And they're looking for qualified nominees. I'm happy to report that well over 50% of the nominees that have gone through under the Biden administration for the federal courts have been bipartisan. I'm going to check on the exact number and enter into the record at this point, but it's a dramatic majority that have been bipartisan. And every single federal nominee from President Biden has been judged well qualified or better by the American Bar Association. That was not the case under previous administration of President Trump. And it makes a difference whether a person has the quality, background, and the integrity to serve on the court. So I'm proud of what we've achieved, and I hope we can close the year with an understanding that even more will be filling the vacancies on the bench. Madam President, my major reason for coming to the floor, in addition to that important topic, is to discuss an issue which I have been bringing to the attention of the Senate for some time. Predatory higher education schools that are deceiving and swindling students and burying them in mountains of debt. Many of the students in high school looking for a college don't realize that there are several different categories of schools that are available. Some of their families have never had a college experience. For the young people, it's the first one in the family to try it. And they're deluged with all sorts of brochures and advertising for schools. The ones who send the most advertising and even show up on television and other places are the for-profit schools. These are schools that are not public and private universities, not-for-profit operations. They are for-profit. They are called for-profit, and they enroll 8% of all American college students. Remember that number, 8% of American college students go to for-profit schools. They account for those 8%, they account for 30% of all federal student loan defaults. almost 4 times the number of defaults as the average college student. Why would those students going to for-profit colleges and universities default on their student loans at such a dramatically higher rate than the average college student? They do because they're getting worthless diplomas from too many worthless schools. Let me tell you the story of one constituent of mine and what happened to her. Jacqueline is from Carlisle, Illinois, a small town down in southern Illinois, and she was lured into attending a now defunct for-profit college known as Brooks Institute. It really has changed her life. What happened to her next? She dreamed of being a photographer. That was her goal. She thought someday she could work for the Smithsonian Institution, which is just outside our doorway. And so she applied to college, and she carefully laid out the pros and cons of attending each and every school. On her list was Brooks Institute in Santa Barbara, California, and it sounded like a perfect fit. Brooks sent her dozens of beautiful glossy brochures with lists of its partner employers. It boasted about its 10% acceptance rate at its school and its career services department that placed 89% of graduates. There was one thing that held Jacqueline back: the price tag, $50,000 for Brooks Institute in Santa Barbara, California, to teach her how to be a professional photographer. She called and discussed it with the counselors at the school. The admissions office reassured her that Brooks graduates earned a starting salary of $50,000, that salaries actually went up from there, and that Jacqueline easily would be able to pay off her loans within just a few years. Well, she was convinced. She signed up. She soon learned that Brooks Institute of California was spewing lie after lie. Brooks inflated their graduation rates, exaggerated their job placement rates and starting salaries, and had no connections to the employers listed in their brochures. It was a classic case of bait and switch. The cost of Brooks also was significantly higher than $50,000. After taking out federal and private student loans and watching those loans pile up, Jacqueline threw in the towel. She was no longer able to afford attending Brooks Institute. She dropped out with no degree and thousands of dollars in debt. She tried to make the best of her bad situation, so she took her 90 credit hours from Brooks to other places. She ran into the same reaction wherever she went. Too many students who had gone to for-profit colleges don't realize that the credit hours that they supposedly earn are virtually worthless. Reputable public and private nonprofit colleges just wouldn't even recognize that she'd gone to school there. To complete her degree, despite her debt and all the time she invested, she had to start over. Jacqueline's story is not uncommon. Her husband, Matthew, also was conned by this school. Too many for-profit colleges prey on students, spinning a false story to get them to enroll and then leaving them with debt, useless credits, and wasted time. Bottom line, don't blame Jacqueline. She went to Brooks Institute believing it was a good school. They told her lie after lie to convince her of that. And meanwhile, she's looking around and realizing that a federal Pell Grant might be in her future too. Well, wait a minute. If the federal government recognizes Brooks Institute, maybe everything they're saying is true. And too many young people with no experience with colleges just make the wrong decision. She was one of them. Now Jacqueline and her husband Matthew cannot qualify for ordinary loans that people turn to as they mature. A mortgage on a home, a car loan. Matthew's wages were garnished to pay back these loans to Brooks Institute, and they were forced to close their photography business, sell all their equipment, removing a second stream of income. The last chance of hope was to apply for something known as borrower defense through the U.S. Department of Education. The Biden administration has worked to discharge student loans through borrower defense for people like Jacqueline and Matthew, who were defrauded by predatory for-profit colleges. Under the Biden administration, the department has discharged thousands of students' loans, more than $18.7 billion in loans for borrowers who intended some of the worst for-profit schools such as Corinthian Colleges, ITT Technical Institute, and Westwood College. Madam President, I'm sure you can say this as well. We know the names of these schools. We've run into students who've been defrauded by them. Many of these borrowers have not seen their loans discharged. It is critical that the Biden administration in the closing 7 weeks, discharge these loans as quickly as possible, as well as issue and process group borrower defense discharges for students who attended schools with documented fraud, like Brooks Institute. And in the remaining days, the department must continue to process individual borrower defense applications. This would bring real relief for borrowers like Jacqueline and Matthew. Why is issuing and processing borrower defense discharges so urgent? Let me tell you. When President Trump was going through his first term, his education secretary was named Betsy DeVos. She all but stopped borrower defense applications for years. She called it a free money giveaway and claims that they were processed, sometimes saw no relief actually granted. Once the courts finally forced DeVos and the Trump administration in his first term to process borrower defense applications, the secretary created a factory system for denial. Department employees who quickly processed applications that were hundreds of pages long were eligible for bonuses, while employees who took their time to read the application were at risk of being fired. In Betsy DeVos's final year, the Department of Education rejected 130,000 claims, a far cry from the only 9,000 claims rejected over the previous 5 years. In contrast, the Biden administration prioritized the most vulnerable student borrowers by processing applications and issuing group discharges for borrowers ripped off by the worst schools. History shows us that a second Trump administration is likely to do everything in its power to prevent these students from receiving relief again. But our nation's students who are simply trying to better their lives deserve better. Before the next president is sworn into office, let's make sure the borrowers who've been waiting for relief and students who've been waiting for justice receive it. I've met so many of these students. They were trying to do the right thing. Their whole lives they were told, go to college, improve yourself, get a better education. You're going to make more money in life and be happier as an outcome. They sign up for these for-profit schools and they don't understand they're rip-offs start to finish. They look around and they see all these federal programs being invested in the schools and think, this must be a real college. I'm going to act like it is. Turns out years later, deeply in debt, either with a worthless diploma or dropping out, they've got so much debt their lives are virtually ruined. Young people in their 30s living in mom and dad's basement because there's nowhere to go with all the debt they're trying to pay off. This is outrageous. These schools should have been policed a lot more over the years, I'll say that. But in the meantime, we're in a situation where these students, deeply in debt for these terrible schools, have no place to turn but this borrower defense. I'm urging the Biden administration in the closing hours of their administration, the last 7 weeks, come to the rescue of these students as quickly as possible. Madam President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.